The fare climbed in at 2:47 a.m. on the corner of Lexington and 51st, and Steve Davis knew immediately that something was off. Not wrong, exactly. Just off. The way a photograph looks when it's been digitally altered, everything in place, but the light hitting surfaces at angles that don't quite make sense. The man wore a gray suit, unremarkable in cut, but the fabric seemed to absorb the street light rather than reflect it. His face was forgettable in the most precise way possible, the kind of face you'd struggle to describe to a sketch artist 5 minutes after seeing it. Medium everything, average nothing. "Evening," Steve said, his voice carrying that rasp that came from too many years of late shifts, cheap coffee, and Marlboro Reds he kept promising Maria he'd quit. "Good morning, technically," the passenger said, sliding into the back seat. "Though I suppose it depends on your frame of reference." Steve watched him in the rearview mirror. The man sat perfectly centered, hands folded in his lap, posture suggesting neither comfort nor discomfort, just presence. "Where to?" The passenger recited an address. Steve's fingers hesitated over his GPS unit, a Garmin he'd bought second-hand from a buddy at the garage. The screen scratched but functional. "That's not a real address," Steve said. "There's no 712 on any street in Manhattan." "Try it." Steve turned in his seat, one arm draped over the headrest. 23 years driving a cab in this city. He'd had drunks, dealers, a woman who'd given birth in his back seat on the Williamsburg Bridge, and once a guy who'd paid him $300 to drive in circles for 4 hours while he cried about his divorce. But he'd never had someone try to send him to an address with a fraction in it. "Listen, pal, it's late. I'm tired. You want to go somewhere? Give me a real destination. Otherwise, just try it." The passenger's voice remained level, almost gentle. "What's the worst that happens? The machine tells you it doesn't exist, and you get to say, 'I told you so.'" Steve's fingers drummed against the steering wheel. A nervous habit Maria always said made him look like he was playing drums for a band no one else could hear. He turned back around, punched in the address. The Garmin thought for a moment. The little loading circle spun, then a route appeared. Blue line snaking through Manhattan, perfectly rendered. 2.3 miles. Estimated arrival 2:58 a.m. "That's impossible," Steve muttered. "And yet." The passenger gestured toward the windshield. "Shall we?" Steve pulled away from the curb. What else was he going to do? Argue with a GPS? The night was slow anyway, the January cold keeping most New Yorkers inside, the post-holiday slump settling over the city like a gray blanket. He needed the fare. The first few blocks felt normal. Lexington to Park, Park to Madison. The streets were nearly empty, just delivery trucks and the occasional drunk stumbling toward the subway. Steve kept one eye on the road, one on the rear view. "You from around here?" he asked. The standard cab driver conversation opener. That's a complicated question. Most questions are, if you think about them too hard. The passenger smiled, or at least, the corners of his mouth moved in a way that suggested smiling was something he'd learned from observation rather than instinct. "I suppose you could say I'm from everywhere, and nowhere in particular." Sounds like something a serial killer would say. Does it? I always thought serial killers were quite specific about their origins. Regional pride and all that. Steve snorted despite himself. "You're a weird guy." "I've been told." They turned onto a street Steve knew well. He'd driven it 1,000 times, maybe more. But as the cab rolled forward, something shifted. The building on the corner, the one that had always been a dry cleaner, was now a bakery. The sign above it read, "Montclair's," in elegant script. The windows displaying pastries that seemed to glow with an inner light even at this hour. Steve blinked, looked again. Still a bakery. "Did that place change ownership?" he asked, mostly to himself. In a manner of speaking. He glanced at the rear view. The passenger was watching the street with the kind of attention you'd give to a museum exhibit. Interested, analytical, detached. The GPS chirped. "Turn left in 500 feet." Steve turned left. The street was unfamiliar. That shouldn't have been possible. He'd memorized the grid of Manhattan the way other people memorize their own heartbeat. But here was a street he didn't recognize. Narrower than it should be. Cobblestones instead of asphalt. Gas lamps instead of electric. "What the hell?" Steve slowed the cab to a crawl. "This isn't right. This street doesn't exist." "It does now." The passenger leaned forward slightly. "Pay attention to the light. The way it falls." The light from the gas lamps was golden, warm in a way modern streetlights never were. It pooled on the cobblestones like something liquid. Steve's hands tightened on the wheel. "I want to know what's going on, right now." "You're driving." "I'm serious." "So am I." The passenger's voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it now. Not threat, exactly. Patience. The kind of patience that came from knowing how a conversation would end before it began. "The address you entered is real. The route is real. The street you're on is real. The only thing that's changed is your frame of reference." "My frame of—" Steve shook his head. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you that you'd understand right now. Keep driving, Mr. Davis. We're almost there." Steve wanted to stop the cab. Kick this guy out. Head back to Queens. Crawl into bed next to Maria and forget this whole night. But his hands kept steering. His foot kept working the pedals. Some part of him. The same part that had always known there was something more to the city than the surface it showed the world. Wanted to see where this went. The GPS announced their arrival. Steve stopped the cab and looked around. They were on a street that shouldn't exist, in front of a building that definitely shouldn't exist. A narrow brownstone squeezed between two others, except the buildings on either side flickered when Steve looked at them directly. Not physically flickered, more like they weren't sure they wanted to be seen. "This is your stop?" Steve asked. "No." The passenger reached into his jacket and produced a roll of bills, crisp, new, more money than the fare could possibly warrant. He pressed it into Steve's hand. "This is your stop. I'll be riding with you a while longer." "I don't understand." "You will." The passenger settled back into his seat. "Start driving again. Any direction. It doesn't matter." Against every instinct he'd developed in a lifetime of navigating this city, Steve put the cab in gear and drove. The brownstone disappeared in the rearview mirror. Or maybe it was never there. The cobblestone street smoothed back into asphalt. The gas lamps became electric, but something was still wrong. The cars parked along the curb were models Steve didn't recognize. Not vintage, not futuristic, just different. Variations on familiar themes. A sedan that was almost a Honda but not quite. A truck with a logo he'd never seen. "You ever hear of quantum mechanics?" the passenger asked. "I'm a cab driver, not a physicist. The basic principle is simple enough. At the smallest scales, particles don't exist in definite states. They exist in superposition all possible states simultaneously until they're observed. Then they collapse into one specific reality." Steve's fingers drummed faster on the wheel. "I don't see what that has to do with—" "What if I told you that effect doesn't stop at the quantum level? What if reality itself, the world you experience every day, is just one possible state among infinite others? And what if certain people, under certain conditions, could move between those states?" "I'd say you've been watching too many movies." "You'd say that." The passenger's reflection smiled in the rear view. "But you wouldn't believe it." They passed a diner Steve knew well, Tony's on the corner of 43rd. He'd been eating there for 15 years, except now it was called Anthony's, and the neon sign was blue instead of red, and the woman visible through the window wasn't Gladys, who'd been slinging hash there since the Reagan administration, but someone younger, darker-haired, laughing at something a customer had said. "I want to go home," Steve said. His voice came out smaller than he'd intended. "Which one?" "What do you mean, which one?" "My home, in Queens, with my wife and daughter, Maria and Sophie." Steve's blood went cold. "How do you know their names?" "I know a lot of things about you, Mr. Davis. I know you wanted to be a musician when you were young. I know you gave it up when your father got sick. I know you haven't touched your guitar in 11 years, but you still keep it in the closet because throwing it away would feel like admitting something you're not ready to admit. Who the hell are you?" "I'm a passenger." The man spread his hands, a gesture of openness that felt rehearsed. "That's what I do. I ride. I observe. I help people understand what they're seeing. I'm not seeing anything. I'm losing my mind." "You're not. You're just seeing more than you're used to." The passenger leaned forward again, and now his eyes, which Steve had thought were brown, seemed to shift, catching light from sources that weren't there. "Keep driving. There's something I want to show you." Steve drove. He didn't know what else to do. The city kept shifting around him. Small changes at first. A street name spelled differently, a building painted a different color. Then larger ones. A park where he remembered an office building. A church where there should have been a parking garage. Each change happened smoothly, naturally, as if reality were a river and they were drifting with its current into different channels. In 1987, the passenger said, you were offered a spot in a band. The Nighthawks. They were playing clubs downtown, building a following. The drummer had quit, and they needed someone new. How do you know about that? You said no. You'd just started seeing Maria, and you were afraid that life, the late nights, the uncertainty, the temptations, would cost you the one good thing you'd found. So you turned them down, got your hack license instead, settled into a life that was safer, if not happier. Steve's throat felt tight. What's your point? In some realities, you said yes. The passenger pointed out the window. They were passing a record store, actual records, vinyl, the kind of place Steve hadn't seen in years. In the window display, there was a poster, a band, 4 men, instruments ready. The drummer sat behind a kit that gleamed under stage lights. The drummer was Steve, different Steve, thinner, longer hair, a few more lines around the eyes, but unmistakably, impossibly him. The poster said, "The Nighthawks, sold out at Madison Square Garden." Steve slammed the brakes. The cab lurched to a stop in the middle of the street. Somewhere behind him a horn honked. That wrong, underwater sound again, but he ignored it. That's not possible. It's not only possible. It happened. The passenger's voice was gentle now. In that reality, you took the risk. You played drums for the Nighthawks. They got big. You got famous. You also got divorced twice, developed a cocaine problem in the early 90s, and haven't spoken to your daughter in 6 years. My daughter, Sophie, she doesn't exist in that. She exists, but she's not yours. Maria married someone else, had a different child, a son. His name is Marcus. Steve couldn't breathe. The cab suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. He fumbled with the door handle, stumbled out onto the sidewalk, gasped for air that tasted like rain and ozone and something else, something electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. The passenger emerged from the cab calmly, adjusting his collar. It's disorienting at first. The first few shifts are the hardest. Shifts? This is insane. This is literally insane. Is it? The passenger gestured at the street around them. Look closer, Mr. Davis. Really look. Steve looked. The people walking past them, not many at this hour, but a few, didn't seem to notice anything unusual. A woman in a red coat glanced at him, then away. A man walking a dog that Steve didn't recognize the breed of kept moving without breaking stride. They were living their lives, normal lives, as if a cab driver having an existential crisis on the sidewalk was nothing worth mentioning. Every choice creates a branch, the passenger said. Every decision, every moment of chance, every particle that could have gone one way but went another. The universe isn't a line. It's a tree with infinite branches, and some people, some very rare people, can travel between them. People like you, people like me. The passenger paused. And people like you. Steve laughed. It came out harsh, bitter, wrong. I'm a cab driver. You're a quantum passenger who forgot what he was. The man's eyes shifted again, catching colors that didn't exist in this spectrum. You've been jumping realities your whole life, Mr. Davis. You just didn't know it. Every time you made a decision that felt like fate, every time you turned down a street you hadn't intended to, every time you met someone's eyes and felt a jolt of recognition, that was you, slipping between branches, unconsciously, instinctively. That's crazy. That's physics. Just not the physics they teach in schools. Steve leaned against the cab. His legs felt weak. His hands were shaking. He looked at the poster in the record store window. Other Steve, successful Steve, alone and broken Steve, and felt something crack open in his chest. I want to go home, he said again. My real home, my real wife, my real daughter. The passenger nodded slowly. I can take you there. But first, you need to understand something. What? You may not recognize it when you see it. They drove for what felt like hours. Maybe it was hours. Time had stopped behaving the way Steve expected it to. His watch showed 3:15, then 2:47, then 4:02, then 3:15 again. The passenger said nothing about it. Just watched the city scroll past with that museum visitor patience, occasionally directing Steve to turn left or right or straight through intersections that seemed to multiply and divide like cells. The shifts came faster now. Steve learned to spot them, a flicker in his peripheral vision, a brief sensation of pressure behind his eyes, and then the world was slightly different. A billboard advertising a movie he'd never heard of. A street vendor selling food from a cart with writing he couldn't read. A police car with lights that flashed purple instead of red and blue. "How many realities are there?" Steve asked. His voice had gone flat, the shock settling into something that felt almost like acceptance. Almost. Infinite. Literally infinite. The passenger adjusted his collar. He did that a lot, Steve noticed, like a nervous tic that had been carefully cultivated to seem natural. Most of them are nearly identical. The differences are at the quantum level, an electron here, a photon there. But some branches diverge dramatically. Different histories, different laws of physics, different versions of the people you know, different versions of me, infinite versions of you. Some are cab drivers, some are musicians, some are doctors, lawyers, teachers, criminals. Some died young, some were never born at all. The passenger paused. Some are sitting in a cab right now, having this exact conversation, except they're the passenger, and I'm the driver. Steve's fingers drummed against the wheel. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be true. They passed through a reality where the Twin Towers still stood, gleaming against a pre-dawn sky that was somehow greener than it should have been. Steve stared at them until they flickered and vanished, replaced by the familiar absence, the gap in the skyline that still felt like a missing tooth. "That's not fair," he said quietly. "No, it isn't. All those people in that reality, they're still alive. Yes, going about their lives, getting coffee, fighting with their spouses, complaining about the subway. They have no idea how close they came to not existing." The passenger's voice carried something that might have been sadness, or might have been something older than sadness. Every reality has its tragedies and its miracles. The distribution is just different. Steve thought about Maria, about Sophie, about the small apartment in Queens that always smelled like Maria's cooking, and the lavender soap Sophie used because she'd decided at age 7 that she wanted to smell like a garden. He thought about the guitar in the closet, the one he never played, the one that represented every road not taken. "I need to see them," he said. "My family, the real ones." "Define real." "Don't do that. Don't get philosophical on me. You know what I mean." The passenger sighed, the first truly human sound Steve had heard him make. "The family you remember, the ones you went home to last night, or what you think of as last night. Yes, I can take you there, but I need you to understand something first." "What?" "They might not be the ones you left." Steve's hands tightened on the wheel. "Explain. You've been shifting all night. Each shift takes you further from your origin point. The reality we're in now is—" The passenger paused, seeming to calculate. "Approximately 743 branches removed from where you started." 743? Give or take. The exact number is difficult to determine. The branches don't behave linearly. So my family, Maria and Sophie, they're 700 realities away? The Maria and Sophie you remember, yes. But there are versions of them here, in this reality. They're just—" Another pause. "Different." Steve pulled the cab over. They were on a street he didn't recognize, in a neighborhood that felt like Queens, but looked like someone had reassembled it from memory with a few pieces missing. Row houses with slightly wrong proportions. Trees that were too tall or too short. A fire hydrant that was yellow instead of red. "Show me," he said. "Are you sure?" "Show me." The passenger nodded slowly. "Drive to your address, the one you know. Let's see what we find." Steve drove. The streets rearranged themselves as he went, familiar names appearing and disappearing, but somehow his hands knew the way. Left on Northern Boulevard, right on Junction, straight through the intersection where he'd once rear-ended a delivery truck and spent 3 hours arguing with the driver about whose fault it was. Except now the intersection had a roundabout, and there was a statue in the center of it, a bronze figure of a woman holding something that might have been a torch, or might have been a sword. His building appeared. Same brick facade, same cracked stoop, same window on the 3rd floor where he and Maria had hung those stupid Christmas lights that she loved, and he pretended to hate. The lights were there now, glowing faintly in the pre-dawn darkness, and Steve felt something loosen in his chest. "Looks the same," he said. "Looks can deceive." Steve parked the cab. His hands were shaking as he turned off the engine. The passenger made no move to follow as Steve stepped out onto the sidewalk, walked up the cracked concrete path, climbed the steps he'd climbed 10,000 times. The door was unlocked. It was always unlocked. Maria refused to lock it, said it made her feel like she was living in a prison, and they'd fought about it 100 times without either of them ever winning. The stairwell smelled like pine sol and something else, garlic, maybe, from Mrs. Kowalski's apartment on the 2nd floor. Steve climbed. 3rd floor. The door with the brass numbers that had been crooked since before they moved in. 3B. He stood there for a long moment, his hand raised to knock on his own door. Then he heard it. Laughter. Maria's laughter. That sound he'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. The one that always started high and descended into a sort of breathless wheeze that she was embarrassed about, but he found irresistible. She was laughing at something, and Steve's heart surged with relief and joy and another voice, a man's voice. Deep, warm, familiar in a way Steve couldn't place. He didn't knock. He opened the door. The apartment was his. Same layout, same furniture, same photograph on the wall of him and Maria on their wedding day, except the man in the photograph wasn't him. The man on the couch, the one making Maria laugh, the one with his arm draped casually over her shoulders. He looked up as the door opened. He had Steve's eyes, Steve's jaw, the same small scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident, but he was thinner, better dressed, and there was something in his expression that Steve had never seen in his own mirror. Confidence, ease, the look of a man who had made different choices and found them satisfying. "Can I help you?" the other Steve asked. His voice was Steve's voice, but smoother, without the rasp. Maria was staring at him. Her face had gone pale. "Steve, what? How are you? You're supposed to be..." "Supposed to be where?" Steve heard himself ask. The other Steve stood up slowly. He was taller too, or maybe just stood straighter. "Maria, do you know this man? He looks like..." Maria's hand went to her mouth. "Oh my God. He looks exactly like..." "Where's Sophie?" Steve demanded. His voice cracked on his daughter's name. "Where's my daughter?" The other Steve's expression shifted. Confusion, then something harder. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm you. I'm..." Steve's legs gave out. He grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. "I'm you. From somewhere else. I don't know how to explain it." Maria was standing now too, her eyes wide, her hand still pressed against her lips. She looked the same. Exactly the same. The same dark hair with the single streak of gray she refused to dye. The same laugh lines around her eyes. The same small mole on her left cheek that Steve had kissed 1,000 times. But she was looking at him like he was a stranger, like he was something that didn't belong in her living room. "Sophie," Steve said again. "Please, where is she?" Maria and the other Steve exchanged a glance. Something passed between them, the kind of silent communication that only comes from years of intimacy, years of shared history, years of knowing someone so well that words become redundant. "We don't have a daughter," Maria said quietly. We couldn't. There were complications and..." Her voice broke. "We don't have children." The floor tilted. Or maybe Steve tilted. The world had stopped making sense hours ago. But this was worse. This was the foundation cracking. This was the thing he'd built his whole identity around, dissolving like sugar in rain. "No," he said. "No, that's not. Sophie is 7. She has your eyes and my stubborn streak, and she's obsessed with dinosaurs right now. She wants to be a paleontologist. You need to leave." The other Steve's voice had gone cold. "I don't know who you are or how you got in here, but you need to leave now before I call the police." "I'm you," Steve whispered. "I'm you, and she's my wife. And somewhere there's a little girl who's wondering where her daddy is." The other Steve moved toward him. Not aggressive exactly, but firm, the way you'd approach a wounded animal that might bite. "Buddy, I don't know what you're on, but you're scaring my wife. I'm giving you 10 seconds to walk out that door before..." "Steve, wait." Maria's voice cut through. She was staring at him, really staring, the way she used to when they were first dating, when she was trying to figure out if he was worth the risk. "The scar, above his eye. It's identical." The other Steve paused, looked at the scar. His hand went unconsciously to his own forehead, tracing the same mark. "That doesn't mean anything. It's the same, exactly the same. And the way he holds his shoulders when he's upset, that's you. That's exactly you." Maria took a step toward Steve. Her hand reached out, trembling, and touched his face. Her fingers were warm. Real. Who are you? I'm your husband, Steve said. In another life. In another... He couldn't find the words. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come here. I thought... Thought what? I thought you'd be mine. Maria's eyes filled with tears. The other Steve stood frozen, caught between protective instinct and something else. Recognition, maybe. The dawning understanding that the impossible was standing in his living room, wearing his face. You should go, Maria said softly. I don't understand what's happening, but you should go. Steve nodded. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else as he backed toward the door. The other Steve watched him with an expression that had shifted from hostility to something more complicated. Fear, curiosity, the beginning of questions that had no good answers. Take care of her, Steve said to his other self. Whatever you do, whatever choices you make, take care of her. The other Steve nodded slowly. I always do. Steve closed the door behind him. The stairwell was silent. The pine sol smell had been replaced by something else ozone, that electrical charge that preceded the shifts. Steve walked down the stairs like a man in a dream, each step feeling simultaneously inevitable and impossible. The passenger was waiting by the cab. He said nothing as Steve approached, just opened the back door and gestured for Steve to take the wheel. You knew, Steve said. You knew they wouldn't be mine. I suspected. Why did you let me go up there? Because you needed to see. The passenger's voice was gentle, but there was something beneath it. Not cruelty exactly, more like the compassion of a surgeon who knows the cut is necessary. You needed to understand what you're dealing with, the stakes of what's happening to you. Steve got in the cab. His hands found the wheel. The familiar leather, cracked and worn, felt like the only real thing in the universe. Where's my daughter? He asked. My real daughter, the one I tucked into bed last night. The one who asked me to check under her bed for monsters, even though she's too old to believe in monsters. She exists. In the reality you came from, she exists. Then take me there. Take me back. The passenger was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something Steve hadn't heard before. Regret. I'm not sure I can. What do you mean you're not sure? You've been driving me through realities all night. You know how this works. Just reverse it. Take me back the way we came. It doesn't work like that. The shifts aren't linear. We can't retrace our steps because our steps don't exist anymore. Each reality we've passed through has continued on without us. The path we took is... He paused, searching for the right word. Collapsed. Like footprints in sand after the tide comes in. Steve's fingers drummed against the wheel. Faster now, more frantic. So what are you saying? I'm stuck? I can never go home? I'm saying it's complicated. There may be a way. But first I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you at the beginning. What? The passenger leaned forward. His eyes did that shifting thing again, catching colors from nowhere. And Steve realized he could see something in them. Reflections of other places, other times, other versions of this same conversation happening in infinite variations across infinite realities. You've done this before, the passenger said. This isn't your first time jumping between realities, Mr. Davis. It's not even your 100th. You've been doing this for decades. Longer, maybe. And at some point, I don't know exactly when you chose to stop. You found a reality you wanted to stay in, a life you wanted to live, and you chose to forget everything else. You buried your true nature so deep that even you couldn't find it. That's insane. Is it? Think about your life. Really think about it. How many times have you been somewhere you don't remember traveling to? How many times have you met someone who seemed to know you when you had no memory of meeting them? How many times have you woken up feeling like the world was slightly different than it was the night before? Steve wanted to argue, wanted to dismiss this as the ravings of a lunatic in a gray suit. But the memories were there, not clear, not complete, but there. The times he'd found himself on streets he didn't know how he'd reached. The faces that seemed familiar without reason. The persistent sense, beneath everything, that his life was a thin layer over something deeper and stranger. Even if that's true, he said slowly, it doesn't matter. I don't want to be a quantum passenger or whatever you call it. I want to be Steve Davis, cab driver, husband, father. I want my life back. I understand. Do you? Do you have a family? Do you have someone waiting for you at the end of the night, wondering where you are? The passenger's expression flickered. For just a moment he looked almost human tired, sad, carrying a weight that Steve couldn't begin to imagine. I did. Once. A long time ago. In a reality very different from this one. He paused. I lost them the same way you're afraid of losing yours. By not understanding what I was. By not being able to control it. How do I control it? How do I stop the shifting and just stay? That's what I'm trying to help you with. The passenger gestured at the city outside the windshield. But first, you need to see more. You need to understand the full scope of what's happening. The realities are bleeding into each other, Mr. Davis. The boundaries are breaking down. And you, whether you remember it or not, are part of the reason why. Steve started the engine. The cab rumbled to life beneath him, familiar and strange all at once. Where to now? The passenger smiled that not-quite-human smile. Anywhere. Everywhere. The destination doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what you learn along the way. Steve pulled away from the curb, leaving behind an apartment that was his but wasn't. A wife who was his but wasn't. A life that was his but would never be again. The night stretched ahead of them, infinite and uncertain, full of realities waiting to be born. They drove through 17 more realities before Steve stopped counting. In one, Manhattan was a forest, actual trees growing through the asphalt, vines crawling up buildings that had been abandoned for what looked like centuries. In another, the sky was the wrong color, a bruised purple that made Steve's eyes ache. In a third, he saw himself walking down the street holding hands with a woman who wasn't Maria, and the other Steve looked happy in a way that felt like an accusation. Each shift came with that pressure behind his eyes, that flicker at the edge of vision. Steve learned to anticipate them, to brace himself the way you brace for turbulence on an airplane. It didn't make them easier, just more predictable. Tell me about the first time, he said finally. They were stopped at a red light in a reality where the traffic signals were vertical instead of horizontal. The first time I jumped, if I've really been doing this my whole life. The passenger considered the question. You were 6 years old. Your family was driving to visit your grandmother in Pennsylvania. There was an accident. A truck ran a red light. In most realities, everyone survived. Minor injuries. But you, the version of you that became what you are now, you were in a reality where the outcome was different, where your mother didn't survive. Steve's hands went still on the wheel. My mother's alive. She lives in Florida. I called her last week. She's alive in the reality you settled into. In your original branch, she died in that accident. You were 6, and you were trapped in the car with her body for almost an hour before the paramedics arrived. The passenger's voice carried no judgment, no pity, just facts. The trauma triggered something. A survival mechanism, maybe. Or maybe it was always in you, waiting to be activated. Either way, you shifted. You woke up in a hospital in a reality where your mother had survived, where the truck had missed your car by inches. You didn't understand what had happened. You just knew that she was alive, and that was all that mattered. The light turned green. Steve didn't move. You're telling me I've been running from that moment my entire life. Not running, searching. Every shift, every jump, whether you knew you were doing it or not, has been an attempt to find the version of reality where everything worked out, where you could be happy, where the people you love were safe. The passenger paused. The reality where Maria exists, where Sophie exists, you didn't find it by accident. You found it because you needed it to exist, and somewhere in the vast infinity of possible worlds it did. A horn blared behind them. Steve startled, pressed the gas, drove forward through an intersection that seemed to stretch and compress as they passed through it. So Sophie, my daughter, she's real as anything. The reality you found, the life you built there, it wasn't fake, it wasn't imaginary. It existed, and you lived in it, and everything you remember happening actually happened. The passenger's voice softened. But it wasn't your origin, it was your destination, a destination you chose to forget choosing. Why would I forget? Because remembering was too painful. Because knowing that infinite other versions of your life existed, versions where you'd failed, where Maria had died, where Sophie had never been born, made it impossible to be present in the one you'd chosen. So you buried it, deep, and for 15 years you've been living as if that life was the only one you'd ever known. Steve thought about the guitar in the closet, the way he'd avoided it for over a decade, Not because he didn't want to play anymore, but because looking at it made him feel something he couldn't name. A grief for roads not taken, a mourning for selves he'd never been. What changed? He asked. Why is this happening now? Why are the shifts starting again? The passenger didn't answer immediately. When Steve glanced in the rearview mirror, the man was staring out the window at a city that was shifting faster now, buildings flickering between versions, street signs cycling through languages, the very air seeming to vibrate with instability. The boundaries are breaking down, the passenger finally said. Between realities, between versions, something is happening. I don't know what exactly, that's causing the branches to bleed into each other. People like us, the ones who can move between worlds, we're being pulled back into the current, whether we want to be or not. And if I don't want to be? If I just want to go home and forget this ever happened? Then you need to find your anchor, the thing that ties you to a single reality, the reason you chose to stop jumping in the first place. Maria, Sophie. Yes, but it's not enough to just find them. You need to remember why you chose them, what it was about that specific reality, that specific life, that made you want to stay. The city outside the windows had stabilized, but only slightly. They were in a version of New York that looked almost right. The buildings were familiar. The streets made sense. The cars were models Steve recognized. But the sky was wrong. Too many stars. And the moon was enormous, hanging low over the horizon like it was about to crash into the earth. How do I find them? My family. The real ones. If the path back is collapsed, how do I... You don't find the path. You make it. The passenger leaned forward, and for the first time, Steve saw something like urgency in his expression. Every reality exists because of choices, decisions made, actions taken. The reality where your family exists, it's defined by the choices that created it. Your choices. If you can remember those choices, really remember them, not just intellectually but in your bones, you can recreate the path. You can find your way back. That's not helpful. That's fortune cookie nonsense. Is it? Think, Mr. Davis. Think about the moments that mattered. Not the big ones. Not the wedding. Not Sophie's birth. The small ones. The ones that could have gone differently but didn't. The moments where you chose this life over any other. Steve drove in silence. The moon loomed larger. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that didn't match any astronomy he'd ever learned. The small moments. He thought about the night he'd proposed to Maria. Not at the fancy restaurant where he'd planned to do it, but in the cab, stuck in traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge at 2 in the morning, because he couldn't wait anymore. She'd laughed at him, that wheezing laugh he loved, and said yes before he'd even finished the question. He thought about the morning Sophie was born. The panic, the rush to the hospital, Maria squeezing his hand so hard he thought the bones would break. And then, Sophie's first cry, that impossible sound. And Steve had known with absolute certainty, that this was the reality he wanted to exist in forever. He thought about the small moments, the Wednesday nights when he'd come home late from his shift and find Maria asleep on the couch with a book on her chest. The way Sophie said "Daddy" when she was tired, stretching the word into 3 syllables. The smell of coffee in the morning and lavender soap in the evening, and the specific creak of the 3rd step on the stairs. I remember, he said quietly. I remember all of it. Then hold on to it. Don't let go. The world outside the cab began to shift again, not the jarring flicker of earlier, but something smoother, a blending. The 2 large moons shrank, the stars rearranged themselves, the buildings flickered between versions and began to settle. What's happening? You're doing it. The passenger's voice was tinged with something that might have been awe. You're finding your way back. Steve gripped the wheel tighter. The memories were flooding through him now. Not just images, but sensations. Maria's hand in his, Sophie's weight when he carried her to bed, the specific feel of his apartment, his life, his reality. But there was something else, a resistance, like pushing against a current that wanted to carry him somewhere else. It's not working, he said through gritted teeth. Something's blocking me. The other paths, the other lives you've lived, they're still part of you. They're pulling you in different directions. Steve saw them now. Not with his eyes, but with something deeper. The drummer on the poster, famous and broken. The Steve in the apartment with no daughter, taking care of a Maria who'd never known Sophie's existence. The 6-year-old boy trapped in a car with his mother's body. Infinite versions, infinite paths, infinite choices made and unmade. "I can't hold on," he gasped. "There's too many. They're all me. How do I choose?" "You've already chosen." The passenger's voice cut through the chaos. 15 years ago, you made your choice. You found the reality you wanted and you stayed. The question isn't which one to pick. The question is whether you're willing to let go of the others. Let go? Accept that they exist. Accept that other versions of you are living other lives, making other choices, loving other people. And accept that you can't save them all. You can't be everything to everyone. You can only be one Steve Davis, in one reality, with one family. The cab shuddered. Reality shuddered. Steve felt like he was being torn in 1,000 directions at once, each path demanding his attention, his loyalty, his existence. And then he thought about Sophie, not the abstract idea of Sophie, not the memory of her birth or her first steps or her current obsession with dinosaurs, but Sophie herself, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she insisted on wearing mismatched socks because she said it made her feet more interesting, the way she looked at him like he was the most important person in the universe, even though he was just a tired cab driver who couldn't give her half the things she deserved. He couldn't save every version of himself. He couldn't find every version of Maria, protect every version of Sophie, but he could go home to the ones who were waiting for him, the ones who needed him, the ones he'd chosen 15 years ago to love more than infinity itself. "I let go," he said. The resistance broke. The cab lurched forward, and suddenly the world outside was right. The moon was normal-sized. The stars were in their proper places. The buildings were the buildings Steve had known his whole life, or at least, the life he remembered as his. "Where are we?" he asked. "Home." The passenger's voice was tired, but there was a smile in it. "Or close enough." Steve looked around. Queens. His Queens. The streets he'd driven 1,000 times. The corner where he'd had his first kiss. The deli where Maria bought the good bagels on Sunday mornings. Everything was right. Everything was real. "I don't understand," he said. "How did I—" "You found your anchor, the thing that matters more than infinite possibility." The passenger reached into his jacket and produced another roll of bills, smaller this time, just enough to cover the fare. "You chose. What happens now? To the other versions? The other paths? They continue. They always continue. Somewhere out there, the Steve who became a drummer is playing a show. The Steve who never had children is making Maria laugh. The Steve who lost his mother is still searching for a reality where she survived." The passenger set the money on the seat beside him. "But that's not your concern anymore. Your concern is the family waiting for you in apartment 3B. Steve pulled the cab over. They were on his street, his real street, and the sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. His building was there, his window, his life. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. "Don't thank me. I just showed you what you already knew." The passenger opened the door, stepped out onto the sidewalk. In the morning light, he looked different, less like an alien observer, more like a tired old man who'd seen too much. "Can I offer you some advice? Could I stop you?" That almost human smile again. "Play your guitar. Tonight, when Sophie's asleep and Maria's reading her book, take it out of the closet and play." "Why?" "Because every version of you who gave up music regrets it. And because the version of you who chose this life, who chose to be a husband and father instead of a rock star, deserves to remember that he can be both. That choosing one thing doesn't mean erasing everything else." The passenger began to walk away. Steve called after him. "Wait, I don't even know your name." The man stopped, turned. In the early morning light, his face seemed to flicker, just for a moment, between 1,000 different versions of itself. "I've had a lot of names, in a lot of realities, but the one I started with, the one my mother gave me, was Thomas." He smiled, and this time, it reached his eyes. "Good luck, Mr. Davis. I hope you find what you're looking for. I thought I already did." "You did. But finding it and keeping it are different things." Thomas touched his collar one last time. That nervous tick that Steve now realized was probably a habit from some other life, some other version of himself. The shifts may come again. The boundaries are still unstable. When they do, if they do, remember what you learned tonight. Remember that you have a choice, and remember that the choice you make is the one that defines you. He walked away. Steve watched until he turned a corner and disappeared, or shifted, maybe, into another reality, where another cab driver was about to have the strangest night of his life. Then Steve got out of the cab. The morning air was cold and clean. His legs were steady as he walked up the cracked concrete path, climbed the familiar steps, pushed open the unlocked door. The stairwell smelled like pine sol and garlic and home. 3rd floor. The door with the crooked brass numbers. 3B. He didn't knock. He opened it. Maria was in the kitchen making coffee. She looked up when he came in, and her face cycled through surprise, relief, and annoyance in the space of a heartbeat. "Where have you been? I woke up at 4 and the bed was empty. I tried calling—" "I'm sorry." Steve crossed the room in 3 steps and wrapped his arms around her. She made a small sound of protest that dissolved into acceptance as he held her tighter. "I'm so sorry. It was a long night." "A long night? Steve, you scared me. I thought something had—" "Daddy?" Steve looked up. Sophie was standing in the doorway of her bedroom, her dinosaur pajamas rumpled from sleep, her hair a wild tangle that Maria would spend 20 minutes brushing out before school. She was rubbing her eyes with one fist, looking at him with that expression of absolute trust that children have before the world teaches them better. "Hey, sweetheart." Steve's voice cracked. He released Maria and knelt down, opening his arms. "Come here." Sophie ran to him. She was heavier than he remembered, 7 years old and growing so fast, but he lifted her anyway, held her against his chest, breathed in the smell of lavender soap and children's shampoo and everything good in the universe. "You're crying," Sophie said. "I am?" "Your face is wet." Steve laughed. It came out ragged, broken, more sob than laugh, but it was real. "Daddy just had a really weird night, baby. A really, really weird night." "Did you drive someone strange?" "The strangest." "Was it an alien?" "Billy at school says his uncle saw an alien once, but I think he's lying." "Not exactly an alien, just—" Steve searched for the words. "Someone from very far away. Someone who was trying to find his way home." Sophie considered this with the gravity only a 7-year-old could muster. "Did he find it?" Steve looked at Maria, who was watching him with an expression caught between concern and love. He looked at the apartment, their apartment, with the crooked pictures on the walls and the dishes in the sink, and the guitar case visible through the half-open closet door. "Yeah," he said. "I think he did." That night, after Sophie was asleep and Maria had settled into the couch with her book, Steve went to the closet. The guitar case was dusty 11 years of dust, but the latches still worked. The instrument inside was out of tune, the strings stiff and dead, but it was still his, still the thing he'd given up when he chose this life. He sat on the edge of the bed, tuned the strings by ear, the way he'd learned when he was 16, played a chord rough, unpracticed, but recognizable. Maria looked up from her book. "What are you doing?" "Something I should have done a long time ago." He played. Just simple stuff at first, chords he remembered from decades ago, melodies that had been waiting patiently in some forgotten corner of his mind. The music came back slowly, then faster, like a language he'd spoken fluently as a child and was only now relearning. Maria set down her book, came to sit beside him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just leaned her head against his shoulder and listened. Outside the window, the city hummed with its usual nighttime energy sirens in the distance, the rumble of traffic, the endless heartbeat of 10 million lives happening simultaneously. Somewhere out there, other versions of Steve Davis were making other choices, living other lives, being other people. But here, in this reality, in this moment, there was only this: a man, a guitar, and the family he'd chosen over infinity. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.